Good afternoon and welcome to our lunchtime learning session. This is actually a revisit or it was an expansion on the session that Jerry did some time ago on risk criteria. And we want to talk about the what and the why and the how a little bit. Now, Mairead set me a bit of a challenge, but for those of you who haven't seen me before, I'm Paul O'Brien. I'm the Managing Director at calQrisk, and I just to give you an idea of who we are. Some of you will have seen this before. Risk compliance professionals. We have a software called calQrisk that manages the governance, risk, and compliance complexity, if you like, for an awful lot of clients. And I know some of you are in the session today, and some of you might be new to the session. So the trick here is to get this done in the time frame. And Mairead, when she put out the invitation, used the word fascinating. And risk criteria in the same sentence. Now, that is unusual, and for me, it's a bit of a challenge, so I hope I don't disappoint. So organizations have strategy, and from that, they have strategic objectives. And from them, they have generally, usually, operational objectives. So the strategy informs the operational objectives. And then from that, risk criteria are developed. The principle here is that risk is the effect of uncertainty on the objective. So if you take the word risk or the definition of risk and apply it to the uncertainty associated with the objectives, then effectively the risk criteria are the yardsticks to quantify the degree. I suppose the degree of the doo-doo we might get into if we don't manage the risks, and to understand the risk in terms of what might be lost if the objective is not met. And to do that, to get a focal point or an anchor around the risk criteria and associating them with the operational objectives, if you can say in a word what would be lost if you don't achieve the objective. So, for example, if you have a revenue objective, it could be profit, it could be sales. If you have a compliance objective, it could be simply that, compliance. And if you, or for example, it might be an approval. If you're if you are registered with a regulator and have an approval to proceed to be in business, it could be that that's lost. So basically, by looking at each objective and getting a sense of what will be lost if it's not achieved, and that gives you some sense of what the consequences might be for the organization. We call that single word, or a couple of words, if you like, the what matters. So using the what matters term to describe what is lost if the objective is missed gives you an idea of, in terms of that what matters, how bad could it be? And on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the worst case scenario, that gives you the opportunity to describe, for that what matters, what the consequence of a substantial loss or failure is. And for each of these things that matter, the organization can describe its worst case scenario in that 5 box. You may well say that, yeah, that will never happen. And basically, when you introduce the fact of the occurrence, then you're now beginning to look at the likelihood, which is down at the bottom. You're looking here at, again, a scale of 1 to 5. You're looking at the likelihood criteria. Generally, they're generally expressed in terms of time periods. Now, the IT people, for example, whom systems matter, will think in minutes, hours, and possibly days across this scale. So but the operations people would be more likely to think in terms of months, quarters, years. Traditionally, the very low ones would have come from the insurance industry, where at one time you could probably look at a loss event that wouldn't happen for 200 years, but that's got tighter and tighter with what's going on in the world these days. And now you're looking at loss events that large loss events at a 1 are probably in as far as 30 years. And anybody who's buying insurance will know that has happened, continues to happen, and get shorter. So what is a 5 in consequence? Your worst case scenario can be something like a complete compliance failure, where you basically get deregistered from doing whatever you're approved to do. A failure in systems, major downtime for weeks, massive staff losses, significant people leaving the organization at the same time, loss of confidence in the board, from the board, stakeholders, loss of confidence is a huge issue. And basically, pink slips all around. So if the management team or the board, key people changed out, that's some of the worst case scenarios. Some are outcomes and some are manifestations. Now, this is slightly, it's I won't call it strange, but it's something just to bear in mind. When you describe something like reputation is a manifestation. So, for example, if your worst case scenario is sustained multimedia, adverse coverage, probably including all sorts of social media, the root cause could be quite a small operational detail. But as a result of the operational failure, the manifestation of your worst case scenario would happen in reputation because it gets out there. So there's crossing effect in the whole grid. This is typical, and we are going to send you a reminder of the link to, I think it was session 4 of these lunchtime learns that Jerry did, and this would be a slide from there. Now, I suppose this is sort of a filled out grid, typical. One of the things about this process is everybody in the organization thinks their risk is the biggest one. There are colleagues who will use the criteria to drive agenda items, new servers, tighter controls. Now, they may not be wrong, but at the same time, this isn't the place for them to drive agenda issues. So make sure there's I suppose there's an equality, if you like, to the 5s, particularly the consequence 5s. So when you look down and you say, yeah, okay, I can believe that this equates to this more or less, and this equates to that, so that you be comfortable as a group with the criteria. Jerry described how you break down the 4, 3, 2, and 1, and generally we would think, if you wanted to think mathematically, think of a log scale 3 going across the grid. But when you start with the 5s, it's the best place to start with the worst case, and don't exaggerate the worst case, but don't underestimate it either. But you are looking at those kind of things, the pink slips, the loss of shareholder confidence, or investor confidence in the organization. Again, depends on the scale, nature of the organization, and everybody will be different. All this stuff is unique, but best to get buy-in from the people in the organization. So compliance can speak to the requirements of GDPR, health and safety. IT can speak to systems. So if you're the risk manager in the compliance space, you don't own it all, and you need contribution from others. You might make an estimate of it and give them some idea and let them confirm, or however you want to do it. But a consensus process is a very cathartic way to do this. It also gets buy-in down the line. So run through the 4, 3, 2, and 1s. The 2s and the 1s are actually harder to do than the 3, 4, and 5s. And for this reason, it starts to thin out. You say, well, what is the value? What is the consequence of that kind of risk? And a very good thing to do here is to look at what you're monitoring. So your audit findings, your complaints, your incidents, your attrition rates, those things that you measure as part of the whole control regime. What you're looking at here is increases in those. So if you get significant increase in complaints volume, it's not going to shut the business down, but at the same time, something that begins to become a risk that may be escalating to a 2 and may begin to think, you may begin to think maybe this needs to be fixed. So take evidence from your monitoring to inform your consequence when you're writing the consequence for your who's and the ones. The other thing I would say is that the more people you have contributing to the input, the more buy-in you will get at 2 levels. One is at the establishment of criteria level, which gives you your 5x5 grid, initial grid, but also subsequently, when you get any challenge to the residual risk, go back and look at the residual risk values that you have on the two dimensions, if you like, the grid, and just see if they are validated when you've calculated your residual risk. And again, you can get others to look at that with you. The why of it, if you like, and it was one of the challenges that I got from Mairead's outline. Why do you do this? So what's the use? First of all, it helps to dimension the risk and compliance effort. And what I mean by that is you put the thing on a 5x5 grid. Now you have numbers, and you can put them in a risk register. You have the 2 numbers together, and generally the residual combination is the product of the 2. So you're multiplying the inherent likelihood with the inherent consequence of finding your starting position. And that's put on a grid which is single dimensional and it's easy to understand. It also equalizes, and I mentioned as you get diverse inputs, when you're looking at the 5, the consequence, you eye them and see, yeah, this makes sense. This would kind of have the same impact on the business. And there's a domino effect in some of them. One risk will beget, or one what matters will beget another. So one begets another begets the other. At the end of the day, you don't know what would damage the business most, but all of them could equally do that kind of damage to the business. So it equalizes that. It makes it easier to set priorities because you're looking at stuff and you say, well, we need to deal with the people issues here because we don't have enough, or we have the wrong ones, or we think that these people are flight risk or whatever. It also makes it easier to effectively deploy resources. So you're looking at and say, well, we need more people in the IT space, or we need more people to do this because these big dangers aren't fully covered. That's after the assessment process. In training, we do alignment workshops, and a number of thoughts run through my head. How do you mitigate the consequence of a head-on train crash is probably the single one that gets me most. So on a grid, when you look at a grid, you look at the 5x5 matrix, you may well find that you have some of the risks where the consequence hasn't reduced. Like, for example, a head-on train crash. Now, that may appear numerically in your residual risk register as quite a small number. It might be multiplied by 1.5. And that is really because you have effectively mitigated as best you can the likelihood of that occurrence. So bear in mind, sometimes they're called fat tail risks, but do bear in mind that they are important to keep visible when you've gone through the whole process. So back to using the criteria to establish where they might be at the outset. If when your controls go in place, they haven't moved on the consequence scale or the likelihood scale, but generally it's on the consequence scale that they don't move, because your controls, there aren't controls that will allow you to reduce the potential consequence of an incident. then what happens is your resources will be deployed not by the residual number, but by that knowledge to make sure that you concentrate on the likelihood reductions. For this one, I don't have any takeaways other than probably the why, and I'd go to questions if we have any. If not, I leave the screen here and let you know that we will share the articles, we will share the slide deck, and the session is recorded. So we'll share the recording on the YouTube channel, and Mairead and our people will. I'm looking at a question coming in here. Oh, it's just a thank you. Well, that's always nice to get.
So somebody has put their hand up, Paul. Patricia. So I'll allow Patricia to talk if that's okay.
Yeah, fine. If Patricia, you're happy to do it. Much my time though. Hello. I've got a couple of questions coming in here, so let me deal with that first before I get to Patricia. So
Okay.
Here, how do you see the link between risk criteria and risk appetite? Your criteria are sort of a flat. They're the flat grid that you want to work with. Now you put your appetite across the top of that. So your appetite statement can be laid over that grid. Where do you want to be? If you want to be at a certain point where your consequences are down to 2, your likelihood is down to 1.5, then you put your line for appetite on that. So, and the appetites will vary potentially with the what matters, because do bear in mind, you probably have more appetite for, say, lending or more appetite for investing than you will have for a health and safety incident or a fatality, for example. So your appetites will vary a little bit, but yeah, you can use the grid to do that. Probably you can set your appetite by, in your risk portfolios and your risk register, you can set your appetite by category. Yes, but the static background is the risk criteria. Now, do bear in mind also that you can have multiple sets of risk criteria. So depending, you may want a departmental one, depending again on the objectives. And do also bear in mind that the consequences for the department won't be as large as the consequence of the 5 for the corporate one. So you may wind up with what we describe as roll-up risks. And again, the appetites may vary if you do that. Complex grid. We do have a session done on risk appetite, so I will send that or include a link to that when we go back to you. There's a question here that says, I've never understood the timescale element of likelihood. If the consequence is catastrophic, what difference does it make that the risk is likely to materialize after 1 or 30 years? Yeah, good question, because it could happen tomorrow. My head-on train crash could happen tomorrow. But when you're mitigating the risk, you have to make the assumption that it's likely to happen at any time. So what you're trying to do is deal with the rarity or the potential rarity of an event, and to get into the mindset, the degree of mitigation that needs to be done to mitigate the event should it occur at any time. And there's a reasonableness equation here. And that's really what the likelihood is trying to do, is trying to put the reasonableness equation on the risk. And it's probably originally driven out of the insurance industry. what is the likelihood of this happening? What are the consequences? And they'll take a weighting on the likelihood, but at the same time, they anticipate and expect that, hey, yeah, it can happen tomorrow. Yeah, it's the balance of avoidance and probably the deployment of resource. Risk will never be managed out of nothing. Anybody who doesn't take a risk basically will do nothing. So yeah, it's that kind of a grid. I've got one more here, and I'm conscious of time. I assume there are times you can affect consequence. When you can affect consequence, a scenario happens that you have holistic measures in place and they can reduce the chances of significant outcome of death, for example. Yes, you can affect consequence always. I mean, what you're doing is you're describing the consequence, and if you describe it as inherent, so before controls are in place, what you're doing through the risk management process is putting controls in place that will prevent. And that's basically the entire effort of managing the risk. Some of that will be regulated. The regulatory authorities would insist that you have these certain things in place, and that's to protect societal. And the mitigation of the risk can happen before the event, during the event, or after the event, in effect. In training, we would look at, for example, a fire alarm. Fire alarm will do nothing to prevent the fire, so it doesn't affect the likelihood. But what it does is it reduces the consequence by getting the people out of the building and saving their life. So so adding that control has a significant effect on the consequences. It will reduce the consequences, but there's no effect on the likelihood. So that thought process that goes into the controls and the mitigations is a very important part of the whole risk management equation. I think that answers my questions. Patricia, I see Patricia's hand is still up, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm talking about, or what my question's relating to, is business disruption as a risk, and then setting the parameters for, what's minor up to substantial. And I particularly get stuck around the substantial. So we've got a little debate going on in here where one person thinks substantial is if the company's down for 24 hours or 48 hours, where somebody would go as far as saying no, it's substantial if we don't have any activity until for 5 days. So I just kind of wanted to get some guide on that.
Okay, I suppose, Patricia, the issue here is probably the scale and circumstance of the business. We did some work with a company that basically is the interface between the customer, the merchant, and the banks with a credit card. And for them, we went through a process, and having gone through the risk assessment process, we found that they had a single point of failure in a particular data center in Dublin. Basically, there was one trunk and all the connectivity cables were in the same trunk. And for them, the consequence of that would be that if they were out of business, not able to complete what they do for 4 hours, they would probably lose 50% of their business, which would be a wipeout. And it's that thought process is, okay, these are the consequences of that failure. And if for your business, if you look and say, okay, what aspects of my business are totally dependent on these services being up and available? And then see, what would the reaction of our dependents, our customers, be if they weren't available for a period of hours, months, weeks, however it is, make a determination on the period and just understand what the impact would be. Would all the customers go away? Would they go somewhere else? Would there be a whole lot of moaning and groaning? Is it survivable? Bear in mind, you had a couple of bank transaction failures over the last couple of months where systems went down at the end of a month and people couldn't get paid. A lot of noise, a lot of agitation, a lot of social media. But at the end of the day, how many customers would have changed banks? The truth is very little. People get to live with pain. And so where you can't factor that into your assumptions, a realistic conversation, I suppose, around a realistic conversation around the impact is probably the best way to resolve any conflict or confusion. What would really happen? Remember a couple of things. Remember what happened in COVID? And suddenly people started to close offices. Everybody thought the sky would fall. And it didn't. We found ways to make it work. I'm way over my time. And I hope that satisfies the question, Patricia. Way over my time, and I need to close it out. And apologies for rolling your dinner break. And it's great to meet you all. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And we'll see you for the next one.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye now.